I particularly want to thank all of our guests, particularly Professor Howarth, for joining us from New York, because we're using up all your time, which is very precious, but it's very, very useful. Thanks very much. I want to direct my first question to Mr. Dean from Mari. First of all, you say that we don't know what fracked gas we import, particularly from the UK. I have a report here from the 1st of October that fracking has ended in the UK. The company that was engaged in it ceased all fracking after triggering a 2.9 magnitude earthquake near Blackpool. So we're not currently, I assume, importing it unless it's lying somewhere in the storage, but hopefully into the future it won't be coming on. I think that's good news because, like the people of Leitrim and people in the Shannon Estuary in Clare and Kerry, there have been campaigns, major campaigns across Britain to prevent shale gas being used. On your point about the importation, the likelihood of importation of nuclear power, would you agree that if we were to go ahead and import fracked gas from the US, despite the contradictions that may exist on the potential importation of nuclear power from France, that all we're doing is compounding one, and that we have it within our power now as a nation to stop this happening, that there's absolutely no need for it? I'm interested in what your organisation may have looked at in terms of the carbon budget that Paris has imposed on us, and have you measured how much of that budget would be impacted on, how much we would lose if we were to import this liquefied natural gas, fracked gas, from North America? And also, have you calculated how much actual damage to our emissions would come from fracking itself? Would you please at some point comment about the science that Professor McMullen here, Professor Kevin Anderson and indeed Professor Howarth have given us in relation to gas not being a safe or acceptable transition fuel? Because this is one thing we haven't looked at. Leave fracking aside, gas as a transitional fuel hasn't been looked at properly by this committee, and I think that's something that we need to, pardon the pun, drill down into. You also said in your presentation that if we were to energetically, enthusiastically and correctly move to renewables, that something like 28% of our electricity needs could be met by waste reduction stuff that the SEAI talked of. Well, if we were to combine that with a massive investment into offshore wind energy, potentially lots of solar powers, rehydrating the bogs, surely in 10-15 years' time, our reliance on gas and this whole debate about energy security would completely look different. If we were to move to what we say we're going to do, the question of gas as a transitional fuel to maintain energy security would have a completely different complexion on it.
Just unconscious of time to start the...
Yeah, I have two more questions.
And I'll let them in just to make sure you get your answers here. If you could keep it brief as well.
Thank you, Deputy. I'll do my best to answer those questions as succinctly as I can. In terms of the UK fracked gas coming into Ireland, the UK has imported a number of LNG shipments from the US into the UK in the last number of months. That gets diluted with the general gas mix. We import significant volumes from the UK. That's the point I was making there. It's not necessarily indigenous fracked gas from the UK. It comes in via LNG into the UK. Noting that LNG imports from the US into UK are actually small in comparison to Qatar, Russia and other countries.
Are they small compared to what we're proposing in Shannon?
They would be larger, yes. In terms of our carbon budget, Professor McMullen has mentioned a carbon budget around 400 million tonnes. We do about 440 tonnes of CO2. We have looked at a wider range of carbon budgets from Ireland, from around 120 million tonnes to 700 million tonnes. That would mean that we would have to reduce our emissions to zero within the next 3 years, or anything up to the next 15 years. So there's, depending on our level of ambition, speed of transition, but some of those really strict scenarios are infeasible. That means that our current level of economic activity could not be maintained while meeting those emissions reductions. In terms of our emissions, we do not examine emissions from outside of our territorial emissions. According to UN FCC conventions, the emissions that Ireland are responsible are the emissions that occur within our own territory. So within our science, we don't actually assess the emissions that come from outside of Ireland. In terms of gas as a transitional fuel, when looking at the future, our research shows a number of clear pathways, low regrets and least regrets pathways. These are massive energy efficiency, behavioural change and significant deployment of renewable and variable renewable resources. But it must be borne in mind that our starting point today is when we look at all our energy, today, 5% of all our energy comes from wind. That's pretty good. That's double the global average. Going from 5% to anything near 80 or 90% in such a short period of time, you run into real logistical issues, turnover challenges. Ireland does need to massively increase our role of variable renewables, but doing that within the timescales out to 2050, it just becomes very, very difficult. And that's where the role of gas as a transitional fuel comes in. The gas itself must be linked to a technology, either producing hydrogen, as Professor McMullen mentioned. That's what the UK are looking at for their 2050 strategy. And that seems a little bit unusual, but they're going to use natural gas to produce hydrogen, break apart those natural gas molecules, use the hydrogen and store the gas underground. This is a technology that is not commercially tested at large scale at the moment, but neither is the 100% deployment of wide-scale variable renewables. But in terms of Ireland, a low regrets or no regrets policy will certainly be massive deployment of energy efficiency, of variable renewables, greater interconnection. That will get us so far, probably to around maybe 70%. Going beyond that, then we have to examine some of the more trickier choices around where do we get those hydrogen from and how do we provide backup, provide resilience and reliability for the electricity system on those days when there's just not enough weather over Norway Street.
Your time's up, but ask your questions briefly.
Yeah, I want to ask both Professor McMullen and Professor Howard to comment on what has just been said by Professor Dean, because I'm not convinced, and I'm certainly not convinced when I hear into the mix that it isn't possible to do these things because of our economic constraints. That says to me that, like you hear in this debate all the time, that market integration, competition, security of supply seem to be put ahead of the needs of the climate, biodiversity, and what the children of the planet are screaming at us to do something about it.
I'll bring you first.
Sorry, Chair, just one other question to both those professors on this topic, and that is, could they please try and describe to us what it would mean in terms of climate mitigation if we were to reduce the methane emissions, just as they've gone up, if we were to bring them right back down. In other words, if we refuse to take gas, if all countries were refused to take gas from the US, how much fracked gas in the US, how much good we could do in terms of climate emission and how quickly we could do it.
Thank you, Professor McMullen, on those 2 points.
Well, just on the first question of the evidence Dr. Dean has given, there are 2 premises there. One is that we can take up to 2050 to get to net zero, and the other is that we can remove from ourselves all responsibility for upstream emissions. Both of those are contentious positions, and I know Dr. Dean would agree with that, and I think it would be good for the committee to try to explore the value judgments and the value on prudence and so forth and intergenerational justice that come into any decision making around that. In relation to the impact of methane and potentially reducing methane emissions very rapidly, the big win there is that it actually does buy us more time. Because methane is faster acting, then if we could effectively constrain, reduce methane emissions in the short term, that would actually buy us somewhat more time to do this complete reconstruction of our energy system, and we desperately do need that additional time.
Thank you very much, Professor Howarth, and I'm sorry to rush you again in your reply. Thank you.
No worries. I agree with my colleague. If we reduce methane emissions now, we slow the rate of global warming now. And unlike carbon dioxide, where there's a lag of several decades due to uptake and release by the oceans, if we are serious about trying to minimize the risk of major thresholds in the climate system and irreversible runaway global warming, we really do need to try and keep the planet well below 2 degrees Celsius. We don't have to 2050 to do that. We need to start moving that way now, and it absolutely requires reducing methane emissions. So I don't buy this idea of natural gas as a bridge or transitional fuel at all. As to whether or not we can move quickly enough on renewables, I think we must try. And there are certainly places on the earth where the grid is more renewables than not already. Scotland would be one example. Denmark would be an example. I'm sure Ireland can do that as well. Are there challenges? Yes, but we as people of the world must take those challenges on if we're to avoid the very, very devastating effects of climate change.
Deputy Ryan, you're next.